Welcome to our presentation on automating maintenance for Hyperion and Oracle Cloud applications. We put this presentation together and presented it at Kscope and had quite the turnout. So we wanted to make this content available for everybody since many of the attendees saw a lot of value in it. So just to get started, I won't go into all the detail on the abstract that we put together for the conference, but just to give a little bit of background on why we put this presentation together. A lot of organizations struggle in the implementation and maintenance of applications where there are many tasks that are, very routine or mundane and take a lot of time. And not a lot of organizations think about, well, what options do we have to automate our, whether it's our maintenance, whether it's the implementation, and how do we save time? How do we ensure that if our maintenance team were to leave the company and we needed to hire somebody else, that we would be able to get them up to speed very, very quickly. So we're going to talk about three things in this presentation. One, the maintenance nightmare. So I'm sure a lot of this will resonate with many of you, and we won't have to spend too much time going into detail on the different issues that you may face along the way. The second that we'll talk about are the three steps that we perform here to reduce implementation and maintenance time by 20% or more. In some cases, we've seen 50, 60, 70% reduction or even more, or up to 100% reduction in many of the tasks that we do. And lastly, we'll give you a behind the scenes look on the software that we've put together and, many of the ones on our roadmap in order to implement and maintain Oracle applications better, faster, and cheaper than many of our competitors. Before jumping into the presentation, just to give you a little bit about my background, I've worked in technology for over 13 years now in a variety of capacities, from a support perspective, from an implementation, from maintenance, as well as support, as I've said, in organizations ranging in size from small businesses to large Fortune 500 companies. I really value education and like to stay on the cutting edge of technology. So I've achieved over 75 certifications throughout my career. And I've worked for companies such as Oliver Wyman, Peloton Consulting Group, and Ernst & Young prior to starting my own firm, Villani Analytics. Have a U.S. patent pending on automating enterprise software inventory and testing. So some of the things that we'll talk about here are related to the intellectual property that we've built along those lines. And then in terms of implementations, we do EPM, BI, master data management, robotic process automation, analytics, managed services. We do have services around automated testing for your applications, whether that's regression testing or functionality testing as well. And we also do custom software development. So jumping right into our presentation here, in terms of maintenance, there are a lot of tasks that application administrators have to do, whether keeping documentation up to date, modifying components, testing components, reconciling data, adapting to future requirements, troubleshooting issues, and the list goes on and on. I'm sure there's probably 2 or 3 times what we've listed here, and it leaves little time for system improvement. And as a result, a lot of our clients and organizations that we talk to will tell us that application functionality has pretty much stayed the same over the last 5 years, 10 years, in some cases 20 plus years. And that's because nobody has time to go and actually improve the system, because so much time is spent on the maintenance aspects of it. And as we look through the typical implementation lifecycle, a lot of projects that start up are, doomed in some regards, just because when you look at the life cycle, you have your requirements, your design, your build, testing, and deployment. Many of the functionality components aren't actually fully tested until you get to the testing phase. Some organizations try to do an agile approach to implementations, and the part that gets done agile is your requirements, design, and build. But once you get to the testing phase, that's when you're ironing out a lot of the kinks, and doing user acceptance testing. That's when you start training the end users, and as a result, you may have a project that's taken several months to build and design, and you're trying to communicate the issues, the any of the knowledge transfer, all the testing, the things you've learned along the way within the last couple weeks of the project. Whenever there's scope creep or projects are running over budget, the first things to get cut are your documentation, your knowledge transfer. So a lot of projects are set up for failure from the beginning, just because there isn't an adequate handoff that's happening towards the end of the project. One of the projects that I've worked on for a top 10 global bank, they were hit from their auditors with a significant deficiency. And it wasn't because the auditors didn't think the numbers were correct or didn't have confidence. It was because the documentation around the financial reports wasn't all there. Nobody could point to one document that said, here's how our data gets from point A to point B. There were plenty of subject matter experts that were able to talk to you how to do it, but there wasn't a piece of paper out there that said, here are all the hops the data goes through, here are all the controls we have every step of the way. So as a result of getting this deficiency, they were told that unless it was resolved by a certain date, they would not be able to issue a dividend to the shareholders. And as you can imagine, a stock that pays dividends, if they're no longer able to pay dividends, that stock price is going to plummet. So as a result, there was a huge undertaking to go and resolve this significant deficiency. Over $300 million was spent in consulting services over a 3-year period, just to document how the data gets from the system of origin or system of record all the way to the final reports that get released to investors. So as you consider the return on investment, things like documentation have a very small perceived value, but if you don't do it right, you can end up paying big in the event that you don't have the documentation when it's requested. So thinking about regulatory implications, having that appropriate documentation. When was it last updated? Because sometimes you have robust and extensive documentation when a system's released, and then 10 years later it's changed 20 different times, and nobody bothered to go in and update that documentation because they didn't have the time. And also just having it, everyone has to know where it is to be able to point to it, where if an auditor or somebody requests it and you can't easily find it, then there isn't much you can do there. And then finally, considering the monetary as well as the non-monetary costs, things like reputation risk, investor confidence. Stories always get twisted where you not having a piece of paper that points to everything can get twisted into, well, this bank doesn't know what's wrong with their numbers, and their somebody's fudging numbers and all of that. So you just want to make sure that you're taking into account all the different considerations that you have. In terms of impact, I know we touched on many of these. I won't go and read them one by one, but some of the major impacts are time, where time's wasted troubleshooting issues that it may have been avoidable if you had a document where you had the common types of issues and you have a new admin that comes in and could easily just read that document and come up with it. If in terms of cost, there could be increased cost due to that time wasted. Some additional ramp up time that may be needed if you're bringing a new team member on board. Quality and reliability. We all know that the 100th time we do something, the quality is much better than the first time we go and do it. And especially if we have a step-by-step document to help us, that quality and reliability goes up. And when somebody goes in and starts making mistakes and takes a lot of time to fix the issue, it can impact the user confidence in the system. And then finally, the auditors, there may be increased scrutiny when you have missing documentation, and there are other implications as we've talked through as well. So that's the first part of the presentation. The second part is the 3 steps that we go through, our methodology on how we can reduce implementation and maintenance time by 20% or more, in some cases up to 100%. So let's jump right in. So our methodology is very simple. It's 3 steps. We start with a task. We break that task down into steps, recognizing that not every step is something that can be automated. So then we just automate what we can. And what we find is that many of our clients, many people that we interact with will tell us, oh, well, that task can't be automated because this little tiny piece can't be automated, so we're not even going to bother trying. And what happens is that what you find is maybe there are bits and pieces that can't be automated and that have to be manual. But if you automate what you can, it can save you a lot of time, a lot of money down the line. So we focus on breaking it down into chunks and automating those pieces, and we've seen great results from it. Just recently, I was on a project where the entire team had to work a weekend because the project was falling a little bit behind. And we went through the steps. The team lead said, hey, we were looking at ways to automate this. It can't be automated, so we need the entire team to spend this whole day and go through these 8 steps. I looked at the steps. I saw, well, it can't be automated because there are some pieces that just need human judgment. But 6 of the 8 tasks can be automated, so why don't we just do that piece? So within an hour or two, we sent out an email with, hey, we automated steps 1 through 6 for everybody. All you have to do are steps 7 and 8. And as a result, the entire team, and this was over 10 or 15 people, it took 2 hours instead of 8 hours. And when you think about that in terms of cost, in terms of time savings, I'm sure a lot of people would prefer to have their weekends to be able to do their own things. We were able to add significant value just by looking and focusing on the things that we can automate instead of looking and focusing on the things that we can't. So we'll walk through a few examples here of how we've used this methodology and how we've broken down the tasks and automated pieces to save time and to save costs for our clients. So our first use case is with DRM. So if anyone has Oracle's data relationship management, master data management software, we went into a client and they had no documentation. They couldn't find it. They said that the solution's changed 400 times since it was created, even if they could find it. And they asked us to perform an assessment of whether DRM could be used to facilitate a chart of accounts redesign that they were going through. So the result was we built some software And we were able to use that for this particular client, where within the first 10 minutes we had a full inventory of their DRM environment. And we were able to use the remaining time reviewing that documentation and determining the readiness for the chart of accounts redesign. So within a week or two, we were able to have a full understanding of all the components they had, the dependencies that were there, so that we could go and do the chart of accounts redesign. We didn't have to go and spend weeks documenting their system, or guessing at various points whether it could. And then during the project, we had some other teams that were downstream systems that would be taking hierarchies from DRM, and they requested, 4 times, or more, that we provide them documentation of the different properties that are available in DRM, and all the hierarchies, things like that. And as many of you know, when someone's requesting documentation during the build phase of a project, it's usually not started yet. And the answer to those requests is typically, well, you've got to wait till the end of the project for us to give you the documentation, or we've got to stop all our build activities and start documenting everything. So just being able to click a button or a couple of buttons, and we were able to give them a full inventory of everything that was in DRM within minutes, rather than within days or weeks. So, how is this possible? Do we have some dark voodoo magic that we're casting in order to complete these tasks? You should probably know the answer to that is no. How we do it is we use technology, we break down the tasks into subtasks, and we automate the pieces that we can. Right. So when we think about inventorying and assessing DRM, there are 3 main components to that. There's the actual creating the inventory and documentation, right? Then there's the reviewing it to determine whether it's fit for use. And then there's the design work of designing the overall architecture of how DRM would be used, going forward to support the chart of accounts redesign. So building in the inventory and documenting, we looked at that and said, well, why can't we automate that piece? So, what if we automate that piece? That's a part that usually takes, a week or two of somebody going in and looking at what's on the screen, typing it out. There are a lot of errors that can be made when you're doing it manually. And then reviewing and designing, well, that's something that someone with experience and taking into account the client's requirements, that it just can't be automated, at least at this time. But building that inventory is something that can be automated. So let's focus on building that piece of it, and then we can that alone will cut 2 weeks off. Our second use case, and we'll show you an example when we get to part 3 here on demoing the different products we have. I'll show you what the result of that looks like and how we were able to use it. But I first wanted to talk through the different software that we have. Use case 2, also with DRM, is a lot of times when you're in the build process of the project, it can be challenging and cumbersome to load in dimensions into DRM. So we had previously built some software that we used, and we were able to bring all the hierarchies for the application in under a day. And for many of you that work with DRM, you may be planning, it'll take a few days to a week to bring in a single hierarchy. We were able to bring all of them in on the first day of the project. So we worked with a leading utility company. So again, they budgeted several weeks to load the 10 Hyperion planning hierarchies into DRM. They budgeted about a week per hierarchy. In order to uh, load those hierarchies into DRM, you could do it in one of a couple ways. You can build some action scripts if for those of you that are familiar with DRM, or you can load them using imports. But as you know, there are significant setup times that may be required. There's some, one-time efforts that ends up being throwaway work when you when after you build them, you don't necessarily need them a second time. So what we did here was we used our software. We had that parent-child hierarchy defined. We asked the team to build it in parent-child format in like an Excel file. We were able to show a visual representation of what that would look like when it got into DRM before we even loaded it. And the software generated the action script that was needed to build the whole hierarchy in DRM. Again, all the hierarchies were generated in less than a day, and there was no throwaway work. So when we think about how we did it, right, we took building the DRM hierarchy as our task. We broke it down into 3 steps: defining the hierarchy, determining the required fields that we would need to load into DRM, and then actually loading to DRM. And we looked and said, all right, well, defining the hierarchy, that's something that we could automate. We could pull it out of, since we were using Hyperion planning as a starting point, we could, we could go and just pull the hierarchy definition from Hyperion planning. In terms of determining the required fields, that's something that we would have to look and see, well, what properties are we going to have in DRM? What's DRM going to house? That's something that, would need somebody to think about it and to plan ahead. So that we looked at and said that's probably going to be a manual task. And then loading to DRM, generating the DRM file and loading it in, that's something that could be automated as well. So why don't we focus on the things that we can automate and use and leverage the utilities there, and then the piece that's manual we can leave as a manual task. This is just a screenshot of what the utility looked like. Again, you can define parent-child format. It has an Excel look and feel to it. You can see the result as the hierarchy. So, a lot of times as people are going through using Excel for building their hierarchies, you can't quite see, how the relationships look because it's very flat when it's just in parent-child format. But here, you can do that, and you can edit the hierarchy through the visual as well as through the corresponding spreadsheet that's in there. And then you just click a couple buttons and you could generate the DRM action script. It can build the hierarchy for you. It can build the nodes. It could update the properties. You can mix and match and generate your hierarchy there. And as we looked at it, we said, well, we can make this very flexible, and it doesn't have to just export DRM action scripts. It could also generate a file that you use for outline load utility or PBCS, etc. So it's a very generic tool. One thing that I highly recommend, please, check our website and check our blog periodically, because, many of these smaller utilities that we've talked through, we're working on ways to be able to distribute them. We're just working on some, licensing details there because we use some commercial libraries in there. So we are planning on making some of these utilities available for free, and we'll have some content updated when we do release them. So, please feel free. You could subscribe to our YouTube channel. You can, bookmark our blog and check back periodically, because this is one of the utilities that we are planning on releasing. Our third use case is automating application testing within PBCS. So many times, one of the biggest selling points to going cloud for organizations is that there are there's tons of functionality that's updated every single month. And for some organizations, that sounds like an amazing thing because they said, well, hey, we don't have to go and patch. We get all these new features. We can use them right away. That's great. But for most organizations, they look at that and that scares them because they say, well, that means that we have to go in and test our applications every month. Probably one of the most requested service requests that's issued, to Oracle is we don't want our patches monthly. Can we have them less often? Can we have them quarterly, or even less frequent than that? And they do that because many organizations don't have people around that can just go and work on testing and put aside their day jobs to do it. So as we went through, we said, how can we deliver the best of both worlds to our clients? How can we ensure that that they can get these new features every month or whenever they want, but not have to go through the rigors of retesting everything every time? So we've been working on a platform to automate application testing. Right now, we just have it for PVCS, but we're working on expanding to other products as well, where we can automate testing business rules, creating members, editing substitution variables, and so forth in a completely hands-off manner. So that way, every single time a patch is pushed to your environment, you can run these tests, and you don't have to spend time, or dedicate people to it to get it all in there. So every time I've told people, hey, we want to build we're working on building an automated testing platform. The general response has been, oh, that's impossible, or that'll take you forever to be able to create something like that. And we looked at it and said, look, this is an area that has a lot of value. There are days or weeks of business users' time that's required to test calculations, right? And no matter how much you try to plan it out, it just always happens, or maybe it's just me, where it always seems to overlap the testing phase of a project with the close, and getting people's time, getting their ability to commit to testing usually falls apart, when you start overlapping with close activities. And testing is often neglected because of the inability to free up users' time. And sometimes they're going through and just checking boxes saying that they're testing because they don't have time to be thorough. Other times they're going through faster than what's originally planned to try to work around the close, and there can be issues and other things there where they just aren't as thorough as they should be or would like to be. And sometimes they just say, hey, we don't have time to do it, and we'll check the box, sign off if you want, but and cross our fingers and hope that it works. And the application administrators are busy. You're maintaining other applications. There's tons of other effort that's happening, and the administrators can't even say, you know what, we'll take the testing off your hands and do it ourselves, because they're usually short-staffed too. So there's pressure, from the business that says, hey, look, we want to get the system up and running as fast as possible. We want the value from it. For the administrators, they just don't have the time to do everything themselves, or to be able to push changes through. And sometimes they do make those changes rapidly, and there's a significant risk to not only system stability but user confidence in the system as well. Right. So as we looked at all these things, we said, well, what if we built a platform that allowed the business and technology to create automated test cases for business rules, data security, substitution variables, member creation, being able to schedule these tests to run during off hours. So you could say, hey, test these business rules overnight. Email me an Excel spreadsheet that has the results, so that way when I walk in first thing tomorrow morning, I can review it and and move on to my daily tasks, right? And be able to notify through email of those test workbooks and keep the relevant people informed, right? And you can keep your auditors happy too, where if you say to an auditor, hey, we run this, we run daily tests of our system, and we push, all the changes through. We run these, we schedule these daily tests, and we have all the workbooks to prove that the tests all passed. Well, chances are they're going to be much happier with you and maybe give you a lot more leeway than if they ask, hey, are you making tests? Or are you testing your changes in the system before you push it to production? And you say, yeah, we do. We don't have any test scripts, or we can't find them, or whatever the case may be. But take our word for it that it's done. Right? They're looked at two very different ways when you have those scenarios. So as we looked at, how would we go about automating such a task as testing calculations, we said, well, let's take an example calculation. Let's just, if we take everyone back to your algebra classes, which I'm sure many of you don't want to go back there, but we said, let's just take we take a number, we add 5 to it, and we get a result. Y equals x plus 5. How would we, what is the process that we would go through in order to test that calculation, right? So we'd go through in a few steps. We'd first input, whether actual or dummy data into our value. So we would say, all right, let's assume x is 3. I'm going to push a 3 in there. And we'd say, well, what would our expected result be if x is 3? Well, 3 plus 5 is 8. So I would expect my result to be 8. We then run the calculation and wait, patiently, as some calculations aren't just a simple, 1 second execution. Some of them are, very complex allocations that may take minutes or hours. And we'd run that calculation. We would query the result and say, what did the system get for y? And compare it to what we're expecting it to be of 8. And we would say, all right, if we get 8 and we're expecting 8, we know the test passed. If we get 10 and we were expecting 8, we know the test failed, right? So we took that, we broke it down into steps of inputting data, specifying target results, executing that calculation, and then comparing the result to our specified target and determining whether we have a pass or fail. Now that we have these different steps, we can say, all right, well, what pieces are manual versus which are can be automated. So inputting data, that's something that we would say is manual, right? There's a piece of actually pushing the data to the system, which can be automated. But the actual coming up with a number to push in the test case is something that someone would have to manually specify and determine. Right, then determining the target results, that's another manual task where you can run through, you could create an Excel spreadsheet or whatever to calculate the specific result, but that's something that you would have to review and look at and say, does this make sense for the answer? So we said, all right, well that could be manual as well. But then running the calculation, I don't see why you couldn't have a system that executes the calculation you specify, and then comparing the results. Well, if you get the answer back and it's 10 and you were expecting 8, that's something you could automate, comparing 10 to 8 and saying, do they match, right? So we have 4 different steps that we've put in here. You can get more granular if you want and break it out further. These are the buckets that we came up with, and we determined what would be manual and what could be automated. And as a result, we built a platform where we could automate testing the calculations. So it's done in a series of steps where user can create an input grid, and the look and feel of that is very similar to SmartView. So if you're technical enough to be able to operate a SmartView query, you're technical enough to be able to build your own automated test cases. You just enter some criteria like the name. You create the input grid of here's the data I'm going to push to the system. Then you choose the calculations that you'd like to run. You can create a retrieve grid in order to enter your specified results that you'd like to compare. And then when the test case is run, the system will query, it'll push the data that you've specified to be input. It'll execute the calculation you told it to execute. It'll then run your retrieve grid and look at the expected results that you have and compare it to the actual results that are in the system. And what it does is it gives you an Excel workbook of that test, so that way you can see, what are the assumptions that we have, what was imported, what was queried, and what were the results. So here you see the final tab of that, where it shows that we passed the test based on what we entered. So those are the 3 use cases. The remaining time we'll just go through and I'll show you some screenshots of the different utilities that we just talked about, and maybe start talking about some of the utilities that we're planning for the future. So from the DRM standpoint, we talked about automating the inventory and documentation aspect of DRM. So we actually broke this utility out into 4 pieces. There's inventory creation or documentation. We said, well, where else can we go with this based on if we know what's in the system, what other aspects can we automate? And we looked at it and said, well, we know which components, what component types may have dependencies on other component types. So why can't we make a search engine where you enter a component that was inventoried, and have it tell you, here are all the dependencies that you should watch out for in case you make a change. DRM is good if you go to delete a component, and it'll tell you, many of the components that that are made. But sometimes if you modify a component, if you're modifying, script logic within a derived property, it's not going to know that, you're making references to other components there. So that great way to be able to, create a report. That way you could get ahead of any types of issues where you say, I want to change this component. What are the other things I should look at or think about? And it goes infinite levels deep when you're looking at derived properties that derive off of other derived properties, which derive off of other derived properties. It'll actually go in and give you every single dependency, an infinite number of levels down. The third piece is, if we know what components are in the system, well, we can also tell you, generate your test scripts and tell you what it is that you should test. We know that many things are tested in a very similar way. If you had a derived property, you would enter, a source input value that's valid for positive testing. You could input source values that are invalid for negative testing. And as a result, we're able to just generate, hundreds of test cases based on what should be tested. A lot of times there isn't, much time allocated for generating and running tests while you're on a project. So if you can save some time and have it tell you what to test, then you could ensure that one, you're saving time and cost, but also you're ensuring that you're testing everything that should be tested, and it's not just something that was cut short because due to the timeline there. And then finally, if the system can tell you what to test, why can't it also run those tests for you and track the result? So some of these features, especially the test script creation and execution, where we're currently working on it, and it's something that's coming very soon. But some of the pieces like the documentation, the dependency analysis, those are already done, and we could demo them to you if you want to reach out. I'll have my email at the end of this presentation, and I'd be happy to walk through any of these cases in your environment with your data. This is an example of what the documentation looks like. So an Excel spreadsheet that just has a series of tabs for each component type. It's all filterable, sortable, and gives you great insight to what you have. This is an example of the dependency analysis module. We're working on the visuals of it, so it just looks pretty plain and basic here. But if you type in, hey, I have a property, this custom.hfm name, what are all the different components that reference that particular property? And you don't have to guess if you're going to make changes. You don't have to say I'm only going to test the things I think are impacted. You could run this utility, you could see everything that is impacted, and you can make sure that you're testing the right pieces. And then in terms of test script execution, this is what we have at this point in time. We can generate test cases, individual steps for each of them, do positive and negative testing within the system. This is an example of some properties here where you may have list properties where you say, hey, it could be one of these 8 different values. Well, if I were to go in and test that, what I would do is I would set that property equal to each of those 8 different values to make sure that it takes them. And then I would also put in a value that's not in that list and make sure that it doesn't take a value that it shouldn't. So these types of things are what we're building at the moment. We're looking at different tests and different ways that we can expand this to make sure that we have a more comprehensive test as well. We have some basic pieces in here, but as we go, we're definitely moving at a rapid pace to enhance the functionality. And then the automated calculation testing, we talked through that in the third use case there. We looked at this and we said, well, we want to make sure that business users can define their own and build their own automated tests. It's not something where you need yet another tech savvy person with a totally different skill set to be able to go in and do it. Setup is very easy in the event that you don't know what are the different steps I need to run a calculation test. We have templates that are built in where you could just go and load them, and it'll tell you, first thing we're going to do is clear the data that you're pushing to the system. Then we're going to input some data. We're going to run a calculation, and then we're going to test the result to make sure that it's working properly. So again, easy to use and to build the test cases. You don't need technical skills. You can run these tests on demand. You could define a schedule to say run these every day, run these every week, etc. And you can download the results. You could have them emailed to you. You can hand them over to auditors saying, hey, we run these tests daily, and you'll make them very, very, very happy because not many organizations, have that at their disposal. And then, no excuses for why your testing timeline is impacted. One of the biggest benefits here too is you can build the test cases as you go within a system uh, with your implementation. Many companies, they'll try to be as agile as they can with their build process, and the team will go in, they'll build some components, then some requirements may change, they may build some other components. They never go back and say, well, am I running end to end testing until you get to the test phase, right? So there's that big unknown of we're crossing our fingers when we get to that test phase of, is everything going to work, right? But if you start from the beginning with the automated tests, you can have them running every day. And if someone goes and builds something that impacts a previous component, well, guess what? It's going to fail and you're going to know about it right then and there. So is it going to take less time for someone to fix it when it's fresh in their mind, or is it going to take less time 3 months from now when something broke and they have to try to figure out what broke, what was the component that impacted it, what was the expected result, what did I actually get, what do I have to fix? So, again, easy way to, you can implement this in the organization. We offer automated test build for you, testing as a service as well, where, if you prefer someone else do it rather than you guys, we can do it in a very cost effective manner. Definitely, a great way to create a simple, scalable, auditable, and repeatable process. Right now we have this just for PBCS, but we're building it for other tools. Definitely reach out. We can prioritize whatever it is that you need. And to build a platform like this, it's only taken us a few weeks per application. So it's not something where we need a lot of lead time or tell you, hey, we need you to wait a year for us to be able to expand this product to what you need it for. So these are the different steps. This is creating input data. Again, looks very much like Smart View, where you can enter your dimensions and your rows, your columns, your POV. Defining the results is the exact same interface where you're entering the dimensions. The only difference here is you're typing in data values of, here's what I would expect the values to be. Whereas in the prior step here, if I just jump back, you're entering the data values of what am I inputting to the system. So here you're saying I'm inputting this data. Here you're saying in these intersections, these are my expected results on a cell by cell basis. And then you build the test case where you can either do it from scratch. You could select a predefined template here in case you don't know what are the different steps that I need. We can do it for you there. And then once you create the test and you execute the test, you can view the results. And again, they'll be emailed to you. You could go in and download at any time here. It's going to show you a series of tabs. The first tab, it'll show you some different metrics, like when you ran the test. It'll tell you, here are all the dimensions that are in your application. Here are the user preferences. So if you want to make sure, hey, I'm running this with 2 decimal places or 3 decimal places or whatever, it'll tell you here are the different preferences that you have. And then a series of tabs where the first tab will be, this is what you input. This is what you said were the expected results. These were the actual results. And then on the last tab, it'll show you, on a cell by cell basis, did you pass or did you fail? So you could see, where the failures were. If there was a failure on a single cell, the whole test will fail. So that way you don't have to worry about getting a success message and, there was a failure somewhere buried that you can't seem to find. So very simple, very easy to use, very easy to hand over to somebody else to show these tests passed. So that's the end of the presentation. My contact info is here. Please feel free to reach out, email me. Obviously we're looking, to work with great organizations, whether they're Oracle customers, whether they're other Oracle implementation partners. consulting firms, managed services firms. We can add a lot of value to any of those types of organizations. We provide advisory and consulting services. We can do managed services, testing as a service. We can, spin up automated test cases for you, have them run, report the results back to you. We could create roadmaps, do health checks of your applications. And in terms of implementations, we could do anything within the EPM suite, BI suite, master data management, analytics, and robotic process automation as well.